The ceasefire that ended World War I began on November 11th of 1918, but that still didn't set the peace treaty. They had to negotiate, and the people that are doing the negotiating and the ones that really set the term for the Versailles Treaty are going to be the Big Four. Now, the Big Four is Britain, France, Italy, and the United States. And they're really going to be the ones that set the terms for the peace treaty because the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians lost the war. They weren't going to be the ones that got to have any of the compromises. Now, this is going to take place in Paris. You can see here. It's called the Paris Peace Treaty. And Woodrow Wilson is going to personally attend the Paris Peace Treaty negotiations. It's one of the first times this happens in U.S. history. He goes to Paris. He makes a couple of political blunders. First of all, he forgot to, well, he didn't want to bring any Republicans along with him. Remember, Wilson is a Democrat. He had a political tiff with the Republicans, refused to bring any of them along. This is going to hurt him in the post-treaty negotiations. Now, he's going there to push the 14 points. Remember, this was his plan in order to prevent a future world war. He had these 14 ideas, thought that it would make the world safe democracy and would allow diplomacy without the violence. He's going to fight when he gets there. First of all, he came there as a triumphant victor. People were throwing laurels at his feet. They thought he was great, but it doesn't last very long. He's going to fight to include the League of Nations. This is a place where he said that countries could go to this League of Nations. They could send diplomats, and they could negotiate and talk rather than have secret negotiations, secret alliances, and open warfare. The Big Four are going to agree to this, but they demand several concessions. The British and the French were devastated by this war. Remember, the Germans were as well. But if you recall, the British and French were in so much war debt that they couldn't afford to pay for it. So they wanted to make the Germans pay for it. So, and they also wanted to punish the Germans. So in order to do that, they demanded two separate clauses in order to get the League of Nations in. They wanted to add the war guilt clause and a reparations clause. Now, the war guilt clause said that the Germans were responsible for starting the war, but think back about two videos. The Germans didn't start it. It was the Austro-Hungarians punishing a Serbian who killed the Archduke, and then they brought in the Russians, that brought in the Germans, and then brought in the British and the French. It was this cascading system of alliances. However, the Big Four needed the war guilt clause in order to get the reparations. This meant that the Germans were going to have to pay all of the war debts of the British and the French. That $2 billion worth of debt that was owed to the United States. Now, at the time, it was common practice for the people that loaned the money for a war, if they were allies, they would just forgive the debt. But the United States says, no, we want all that money. And the British and the French said, well, we don't know how to do it, so we're going to make the Germans pay for it. This is all wrapped up in what's referred to as the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Treaty of Versailles is going to create the conditions that lead to the rise of the Nazis, because the Germans are incredibly embarrassed that they had to accept guilt for a war that they don't feel they started. They also had to pay the reparations, which completely decimated their economy. So you have a starving, embarrassed, and desperate people looking for any sort of savior they can find. And in the 1930s, they're going to find it in Adolf Hitler.